Okay. Well, thanks, Matt, and welcome everyone. This is the Virginia Coastal Resilience Technical Advisory Committee. You have received the agenda, and so as you can see today, we have a pretty full one. We're going to be going through some old business that we discussed in our last in-person meeting, which was here at DEQ, and then we'll open up some new business. We have a couple of invited guests today who will also be speaking, and then, of course, we'll have public comment. We'll talk about some of our last agenda items, etc. With that said, want to go through, or actually, Matt, I think you're going to go through and do the roll call. Is that correct?
Yep.
I just realized I didn't introduce myself. My apologies. My name is Evan Bernowski. I'm over at DEQ, and of course, I am the chairperson of this subcommittee. So, with that said, Matt, I'll turn it over to you. You can go through, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thanks, Evan. Hello, everyone. This is Matt Dowling, Office of Resilience Planning Program Manager at DCR and staff to the TAC in this subcommittee. And we're going to go through and do roll call based on the order that it's listed on the slide. If you could unmute yourself and either say here or present, and we'll go through the list. And this is just a reminder for the general public that are on and listening to this event. Please keep your microphone on mute. There will be an opportunity to provide public comment at the end of this meeting. All right, so starting off with roll call, Evan Bernowski. Is here. Dave Davis. I guess Wheeler, can all the members, they can unmute themselves? Wheeler can't hear you.
I'm going to ask him to unmute.
Okay. All right. So we've got Evan and Dave here. Next, Whitney Ketchmark, HRPDC.
Hey, Matt, this is Ben McFarland. I'm here for HRPDC today.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Norm Goulet or Rebecca Murphy from Northern Virginia Regional Commission. I see Rebecca's here. I guess Wheeler, are they allowed to unmute themselves?
Oh, there we go. It wasn't allowing me earlier, but yeah, Rebecca Murphy here for NVRC. Norm won't be attending.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Dr. Jessica Whitehead from ODU.
They can now unmute themselves.
Okay. So Dr. Jessica Whitehead or Carol Considine from ODU.
Jess Whitehead is here representing ICAR.
And Jess. Dr. Karen McGlathry from UVA. Right. Dr. Mark Lukenbach from VIMS. Hey, Mark.
I'm here.
Jamie Green, Rachel Peabody, and or Randy Owen from VMRC. Right. So look like we have VMRC today. Dr. Troy Hartley from Virginia Sea Grant. Let's see, Troy. Dr. Robert Weiss or Wendy Stout from Virginia Tech.
This is Wendy Stout. I'm here for Virginia Tech today.
Hi, Wendy. Michael Fitch from the VTRC.
Here.
And Mike. Mary Carson or John Bateman from Wetlands Watch.
John Bateman here.
Hey, John. How's it going? All right. And then, as Evan announced earlier, we also have some invited guests that we've asked to attend this subcommittee meeting so that they can participate in our discussions. Again, if you all have any invited guests, colleagues that you would like to have participate in a subcommittee meeting, please reach out to the chair, Evan Bernosky, and copy myself, so that we can make sure we get them approved and on the invited guest list for future meetings. So for today, we have Mark Bennett from the USGS Virginia Water Science Center. Hey, Mark, how's it going?
Good.
Very good. Hold on, I'm trying to pull up another screen.
And Matt, I'll have to leave a little bit before 2.
Okay, great. Mark is the central director for the Virginia Water Science Center with the USGS. The Virginia Water Science Center delivers timely and reliable data, advanced interpretive science to, excuse me, to support effective decision making. Some of the information that they provide through the USGS National Water Dashboard, which includes stream flow, surface water, groundwater, and spring water levels, among other data. So thank you, Mark, for joining us for today's discussion. We also have, excuse me, Kelso Ferreira, an assistant professor with George Mason University in the Flood Hazard Research Lab. Kelso specializes in investigating and developing solutions that increase society's resilience to flood-related natural hazards. Some of his related projects and research efforts are quantifying the benefits of natural nature-based features and some flood hazard modeling, and is doing a lot of work with the Northern Virginia Regional Commission. Also, are you on the line? Don't see him, but he might be joining us later. And then thirdly, we have Dr. Molly Mitchell, assistant professor with the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences and the Center for Coastal Resources Management. Her research focuses on shifts in coastal resources due to the interaction of sea level rise and human-driven changes. And some of her related projects are the sea level rise report cards that not only in Virginia, but across the nation, as well as the Virginia Wastewater Data Viewer. So thank you all for joining us and agreeing to help provide input and participate in today's discussion. Going back to the agenda real quickly, 2 items for, I guess, 1 item for adoption before we get into some of the discussion is the Q3 meeting minutes from our last subcommittee meeting. And if anybody, we did not receive any comments, but if we could get a motion to pass and adopt those meeting minutes, DCR will post final meeting minutes on Town Hall and on DCR's website.
So move.
Second.
Great. All right, they are adopted. And we will proceed with the agenda. Before doing the agenda, just wanted to review our objectives for this subcommittee. 3 key objectives that we discussed at our previous meeting. One is informing the development of our flood hazards exposure model so that we understand where flooding is likely, so that we can plan for that flooding. Number 2 is informing some of the inputs for the flood hazard risk assessment. So what data is going into both on the hazard side as well as the assets side as well. And then lastly, developing recommendations for future planning. This includes, but again, not limited to, helping us with the data development plan, identifying what other data and information do we need, where do we need to, where does the state need to invest and look to have additional research and data products that can help us with this future planning efforts, but also to advise on innovations to address flood risks and fill the gaps in resilience actions. And this isn't limited to just innovations for data, but innovations across the boards of all flood resilience activities. So yes, still in the information, but innovations in outreach, innovations in products, innovations in financial services. And there will and can be some overlap with some of the other subcommittees, but trying to think forward looking, what resources and where do we need development and innovation, because the current set of tools aren't really meeting the standards and helping us get where we want to be. So those are our key objectives for this subcommittee. Just reviewing what we discussed to date. In the first meeting, we reviewed those subcommittee objectives, and largely those did not change at all, but there was emphasis on the innovation part. And again, that it is not just limited to data innovation. We reviewed the pluvial modeling pilot study results and some of the decision points that we need to resolve for moving forward with pluvial modeling. That includes our depth threshold, the land cover data, and the precipitation values, and we'll be discussing those in the old business, as well as we also discussed some of the fluvial data that's available for our statewide Virginia flood protection master plan, and we'll also cover some of that in the old business portion of the agenda. Just looking at the timeline, we're a little bit ahead of schedule right now, but this is our second quarterly subcommittee meeting. We have 4 more subcommittee meetings until the end of next year to provide input and make recommendations for phase 2 of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. Again, our research, data, and innovation subcommittee and our objectives are focused on the flood hazard exposure model and data display of those results, and you see where the other subcommittees are working on concurrent tasks through this planning effort. Specifically, what are we trying to cover on our subcommittee schedules at the quarterly meetings? For this quarterly meeting for Q4, looking at flood hazard data scenario planning in our new business, and the second item, which is highlighted because it was not previously presented in the Q3, is also to talk about how do we report that information and share that information so that it becomes actionable. And so we'll be covering those 2 items in the new business portion of the agenda. Moving forward through next year in the 4 meetings, there will be more emphasis on the future plans and recommendations that can be included in the phase 2 document, supporting research, data, and innovation, as well as still providing some input and review on our current effort with phase 2, specifically on the risk assessment methodology and helping us review some of those risk assessment results. And we will, at the end of today, can discuss topics for the next quarterly meeting. All right. So any comments or questions on schedule or objectives and the overall plan for this subcommittee? All right, hearing none, I'm going to move on to old business, and we are going to start with the pluvial modeling. So there was 3 decision points that we discussed at our last subcommittee meeting, and then also discussed at the full TAC meeting in September. And so the first one is the pluvial model depth threshold. And so at what depth do we visualize the flooding, as well as use for impacts analysis, because where the model outputs will show flood depths less than 1/10 of an inch, which is very expansive. And so where there is no filter area in the red, you see flooding everywhere, a large flood extent, but with an area filtered to a 1/2 foot flood depth, that area is reduced, and we are trying to focus on impacts from this flooding. So part of the discussion was that we were looking at that 1/2 foot flood depth threshold, and found a couple examples where others are using a 1/2 foot for a depth threshold. FEMA guidance generally considers minimal hazard where depths are less than half a foot. And then another statewide example down in Louisiana are their floodplain conveyance zones, and they also have a depth threshold of half a foot. This is where we would like to move forward, and this is, I guess, DCR's recommendation to move forward with a half a foot. Are there any objections or questions to this half foot depth threshold? All right, hearing none, we'll move on. The next item is the land cover data set. And there's 3 options for land cover data, which is used as an input for our pluvial modeling for both soil saturation and friction, infiltration and friction. And so we have the Virginia statewide land cover data set, which is high resolution, 1 meter resolution, but older aerial imagery. Chesapeake Conservancy land cover data set, updated imagery, also 1 meter, but does not cover the entire project area. And then there's an option that was discussed and brought up at the last TAC meeting about kind of creating a mosaic high resolution data set, where we use the best available of the high resolution data set for the project study. So within the Chesapeake Bay watershed and counties that or localities that have a border with that watershed, it would be the Chesapeake Conservancy land cover data set. And then beyond, it would be the older but still high resolution Virginia statewide land cover data set. After the input and some of the desires to look at that mosaic land cover data set, we went back and created a figure to see where the coverage area was of the updated data. It covers all of our 8 coastal PDCs with the exception of 5 localities. And those are the 3 counties of Greensville, Sussex, Southampton, and the 2 cities of Emporia and Franklin. And you can see them in the figure on the right. So looking at this and the more comprehensive coverage with the Chesapeake Conservancy data set, and also talking to Dewberry about the feasibility of using a mosaic data set, DCR has updated its recommendation that we would use this mosaic data land cover data set moving forward for the full production pluvial modeling. Any comments or questions on this updated recommendation?
I guess just thanks for going back and looking at it. I know from our last conversation, it was going to be considerably more difficult for you guys to do it this way. And it sounds like you're taking the hit and doing it anyway. So just thanks for receiving the feedback.
Well, thank you for providing the feedback, and that's what this process is all about. So I think it will be a better product, and yes, look forward to moving forward. Anything else? All right. The next item that we discussed was what do we use for precipitation values? The pilot study used median climate scenario values, so the Atlas 14 median values, and then the Marissa predictive IDF median values for two different climate scenarios and 2 different planning horizons. The duration and frequency would be the same. The alternative to that we discussed was an interval-based precipitation values that are then related to the climate scenarios. So they can be related to what we have here, Marissa and the RCP values, but could also be crosswalked to future and updated climate scenarios. And so that's our current recommendation, is to proceed with the interval-based scenarios. The intervals have not been finalized, and so I highlight the top end of the range, and more than likely we will try to bump this up a couple intervals to try to be able to capture future conditions and future updates to climate scenarios, so that again we try to maintain the maximum kind of shelf life and flexibility of this data set and of these models that we are producing. So this is the current plan of action, again, still need to finalize the specific intervals. But that is where we're headed, and just wanted to open it up again if there's any comments or questions on the what we're using for precipitation values.
I have a question.
Yes.
That when you say add a couple more intervals, meaning longer duration or raising the higher value in there? How do you precisely plan to do that?
Yes, no, it's a great question, and it was poorly explained by myself. So with the 2-hour duration, we looked at what was the median ranges for all of our project area, and all of the frequencies, and so it ranged from 1.45 inches to 7.63 inches. The current model would run at 1 to 8 inches at half-inch intervals. The increased intervals would be to increase that upper range. So instead of 8, maybe going to 9 or 10, trying to capture at least up to the 90th confidence interval of our current projections, and maybe 1 or 2 more intervals. So maybe 8.5 or 10.5, 11, up to 12. Again, just reviewing what the data and projections show and trying to think what's reasonable for future estimates. So again, that we're trying to encompass that we have the appropriate number of intervals to match up to future climate scenarios that might change. And that would occur on each duration. So for the 6-hour duration, instead of going 1 to 11 inches, we could go to 13 inches or beyond, again, after reviewing the data. And similarly on 24-hour duration, looking at where the range and the confidence interval is and trying to encompass and be proactive and capture future projections that might come out.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right. Next, wanted to talk about the fluvial flood hazard data. And for this discussion, more focused on helping advise on the statewide Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan. For the Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 2, we're planning on using the available FEMA data as a baseline, and we'll get into some of that in our new business and how that gets incorporated to our flood scenario planning for the coastal plan. But for the statewide plan, we had discussed some of the limitations of the FEMA data, especially as we go out west. The areas in blue in the figure represent localities that have updated FEMA HEC models that are available to download and work with. Those models have some limitations on their own. They don't include the topography. They don't have all the flood extents and return intervals. So although it's better than paper maps and you have a model, it's still not the ultimate end goal and solution. And a reminder that this FEMA data does not include any of the pluvial modeling. And again, that's a data gap out west beyond the project area. We are also aware that there is pending future federal data that are in the works. I mean, FEMA is working in the South Side and Southwest Virginia on updated flood models for the flood insurance studies and updated flood insurance rate maps. National Weather Service is working on their flood inundation models. They just released their first batch of flood inundation models. They don't have any areas in Virginia right now, but those are coming in the future years. And then the federal flood risk management standards, the data that incorporate represents the FFRMS data, that is underway and kind of hearing it might be coming out sometime maybe later next year. So again, there's data coming about, but what should we and can we use for our statewide plan that's due by the end of December of 25, but we'll need to get started looking at flooding across Virginia in this coming year so that we can work on the actual planning to address it. Looked at, again, the availability of FEMA data, and I updated the figure from the one that was sent out earlier just to show a little bit different color between NHD flow lines and the unknown. So again, the purpose of this map that I see is FEMA, we have some better data in the green areas that we can work with. The data that we do have out west is old, and it does not incorporate all of the areas of flooding. And a couple examples here on the left is an image from the National NFHL viewer, looking at the Big Island area along the James River, which is in Bedford County next to Amherst County. But you see where the flood extents are in these floodplains, but then all of the feeder streams and creeks and open water conveyances, those are all unmapped. And those waterways either cross roadways or adjacent to roadways. And there are buildings and infrastructure and natural infrastructure that can be at risk to flooding, but yet we don't know and can't really capture what that flood risk is because it's not a mapped product that we can work with on the left. And then on the right, the FEMA mapping efforts, they do have a limit of study that they stop and then do not go further upstream. But then looking further upstream along the waterway, you again see infrastructure, roads. There's some limited housing in this area. It's a more rural area. But again, it just goes to show that the data we have, we don't understand the total flood risk, where flooding is likely to occur across all of Virginia in a consistent manner. And because we don't know where that flooding can be, we don't have a comprehensive understanding of and a holistic understanding of the risk that flooding presents. So we're trying to understand, how do we close that data gap, but yet knowing that future work's coming out. Looking at an example from another state in Texas, they have what they call the floodplain data quilt, and not want to get into each step, but it's really that the data that exists within flooding is across a kind of a wide continuum, where either you have no data or very coarse and advisory data to very refined data, detailed analysis that's been field verified, that's being used as a regulatory product. But there are steps in between that end of the spectrum that you can kind of progress. And not every, at least for planning purposes, we don't need detailed hydrologic studies everywhere. I mean, it'd be great to have. It's just very expensive. And so the higher quality the data often comes with increased effort, costs to get that higher quality data and increased resolution of that flood hazard data. And so there's a wide spectrum of data, and trying to understand where should we try to land within this spectrum of data options to be better off than we are now. So looking at that FEMA data where we have a lot of gaps, but we don't have the schedule or necessarily the cost to get detailed studies everywhere. It doesn't look like we have enough resources really to do base level engineering efforts everywhere. Texas is working on that. It's a multi-year plan, and they're on the order of, I think, $50 million allocated to do base level engineering across the state. North Carolina's looking at base level engineering. They've phased that out, and they're looking out to like fiscal year 27. And so trying to understand what can be available next year to get us to have us more informed than we currently are, that can work within some of the constraints that we have. So we are looking at evaluating some third-party vendors that get us, it's in this lower end of the spectrum, that it is of not, I wouldn't say low quality, it's still high quality, but higher resolution or lower resolution. So some of the third-party vendors that we discussed at the last meeting have data that's available off the shelf at a 10-meter resolution, where currently we're working at a 10-foot resolution for our raster grid. Sorry, they have a 30-meter resolution, 100-foot versus 10-foot. So order of magnitude difference in resolution. But is that good enough for what we need to do for a statewide planning effort? And I don't know. And I think that's one of the things we want to look at some of their data and see how it compares, maybe in an area where we know we don't have great data. Is this good enough to work with and plan at the state scale, but also compare their data to where we do have better data in the coastal zone, where we have the coastal modeling, our pluvial modeling, and much higher resolution data, and what are the trade-offs to see if there is a better product that we could use for our statewide planning efforts. So DCR is looking at trying to get our hands on some data to do some evaluation before we kind of can make some decisions, and are interested to know if any of the committee members, or if you have recommendations for somebody else that could help us in reviewing this data. And there's potential that we could present some of the comparisons of our data options at the next TAC meeting, which is scheduled for December 15th, which is also going to be a virtual meeting. So I'll take a pause here and let's see if you all have any input on kind of our choices for what we can do for capturing the flood hazard data, especially out west, for a statewide plan that helps us be more informed than we currently are. If you are interested in helping us review and evaluate some of our data options, please reach out and let us know. It is something that we would like to do, hopefully next month sometime, the next, say, end of October, between start of November and the next TAC meeting. So that kind of 6-week period, trying to look at some of these data options and what could work for a statewide plan.
Hey, Matt, this is Ben from HRPC.
Hey, Ben.
A couple thoughts. One, we'd be happy to help out with the review, but I think it would be very helpful. I know we're focusing really on this upcoming, first master plan, but it would be a good idea, in my perspective, to come up with an estimate of what it might take to get to that base flood level engineering. Even if it's several years out, the sooner we kind of know what that big picture looks like and what the cost is going to be, the easier it'll be to maybe make that case for round 2 of this plan. If we keep kind of kicking that down the road, it's just going to be sticker shock, and I think we'll have a less chance of success. But if we know that it's going to take it's a 5-year or a 10-year process or whatever it might be, with whatever level of funding we can acquire, the sooner we know that, the sooner we can start making more informed decisions with, what the budget is at the agency levels, but also start working with the legislature to program for that necessary funding.
Understood. We've done some back of the napkin kind of cost estimates and see where some of the other states are, and it's looking like order of tens of millions of dollars for base level engineering. And some of our discussion is knowing that, but then also knowing the feds are working on data products, so we don't want to produce something that might be out of date or supplanted or replaced by the federal data in the future. Kind of, yes, trying to put all that into a decision-making process so that we have a data development plan. And that is one of the products that we can come out of recommendations here, but that is also an end product that we're hoping to have out of the statewide master plan document is a data development plan. Where do we need data? So not only the flooding data, but the land cover, land use data, and other inputs to help us plan and implement projects. But we can, I think, work on trying to get more refined numbers and present that so that people have that in front of them when they go to make a decision. Jess?
Hey, I just wanted to second Ben's comment here. I think that getting to that base level engineering needs to be a really important long-term plan, especially as we've talked in multiple other avenues about trying to shift from plans that are informational to plans that are outcome oriented. And to that end, I kind of wanted to ask, as you've been talking to Louisiana, North Carolina, others about the use of private data, private sector produced data, if any legal vulnerabilities have come up that they have encountered, knowing that the use of private data is coming up in some of the legal challenges to the federal risk rating 2.0 system. Are we, the ultimate decision may be that we need to proceed with a private sector product anyway, but making sure that we're eyes wide open on, if somebody uses these plans to scope off a project or some other, need, are they seeing any potential vulnerabilities in those private use of private sector products?
No, thank you, Jess, for bringing that up. Based on some of the discussions with the other states, a lot of the term advisory has come up. This is an advisory product that we are working with to help inform where more detailed products are needed, and that it's not a regulatory product that is being produced that is meant for regulation. But yeah, I think the legal liability question we can dig into, look at that some more. And I think it really comes down to the uses of how that data is used. And I know that's a very difficult thing to control once you put it out there and how it is used.
Yeah.
But that might be part of the, how do we share? And there are some limitations on sharing the data and sharing the actual data itself versus some derivative data. And if it's derivative data that we have more control over producing, trying to reduce some of that liability.
Yeah. And if there is liability that prevents us from, going too far into that, whether or not it's regulatory, but even more toward outcome oriented kind of planning and future iterations, that lends weight to the budget argument for being able to get the funds to do base level engineering. But it, absolutely may just be, this needs to be a bridge to being able to get there, but that's part of the justification as to why we need to get there.
Great. Any other comments or question on some of the statewide flooding data? All right. If you do and think of anything after this, please feel free to reach out and be happy to discuss it with you. All right, moving into new business items. And these two items are kind of intermixed, and you probably saw that in the slide. One is integrated flood hazard climate scenarios for planning. So what are our future looking scenarios and the current scenarios, and how do we want to structure that for phase 2? And tied into that, how do we report out this information? We have a lot of data. It's very difficult to put it all out there in a digestible way. So any thoughts or inputs on how best to structure that? So I'll cover those two items in these next couple of slides. If at any point you want to stop and interrupt and ask a question, please feel free to do so. before we get into those, I mean, what are we trying to do? And I think, Jess, this gets to your point, and having outcomes and really trying to flood hazard data. I can't spit it out today. Who is this data intended to be used for? One, our primary audiences are planning district commissions, so people that are doing regional planning, the localities, so the local and regional units of government that are working on planning. They know these regions better. How do we have them more informed? And then also our state agencies and programs that have a mission that either intersects or is related to flood resilience, or could be impacted by flood resilience. Those are our key primary audiences for this plan. And they could use this information for their own more detailed asset or programmatic vulnerability analysis. Hopefully trying to incorporate some of this flood hazard data into their long-range plans, and then help them prioritize some of their local or regional actions, try to get be more successful in some of our grant applications and have this data support that, and then just collaborate with each other and try to build more resilient solutions across the regions and localities. So how did we do it in phase one? We reported a lot of this information is shared in the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. I hope that you've all viewed the Explorer and played around in there. If you have not, please visit our website and check it out. Within the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer, we showed and report out across 9 different return intervals. So the 2 mean low and mean high water, and then from our 2-year return interval out to the 500-year return interval. So it's a lot of information on a graduated flood raster. And then we also have tables. So at each planning interval, so this was a 20-year interval, 2020, 40, 60, and 80. There was data that was provided for the sum of these, but there was also the availability to download the background information that was used to create these tables and create your own data. So here, recurrence intervals, we looked at, was there 1, 7, 8 of them? No, 9. So it's a lot of information. When we looked at getting into the impact side, again, reporting across the 9 recurrence intervals, but then it was shifted to a relative impact level between very low to high that was using a natural breaks kind of algorithm as where that distribution got binned up and divided into what's very high and high, using a raster based grid that went as small as almost, I think it's is it like 1,200 feet by 1,200 feet. So relatively small scale, and then a relative impact level for flooding. Within the plan document itself, we didn't feel like we could report the 9 different return intervals and use the same setup as 5 different relative intervals of impacts. And so here it's current and future impacts and trying to get towards lower and higher. So just upper and lower bounds essentially for the impact side, and then going from 9 to 5 flooding types between our tidal flooding, which was mean high, mean low, chronic flooding, which was the 5, the 10, 25, and moderate, major, and extreme. So we tried to group some of those flooding options to make it presentable within a paper document or PDF document. Again, just trying to go over what we did in phase 1 to hopefully get some input on where we go with phase 2. When we looked at the regional summaries. Again, trying to characterize relatively high to low impacts again with some call outs. And then for each PDC, we looked at the upper and lower bounds, essentially flooding. So what's high tide flooding, what's going to be permanently inundated today, 2020, and in the future in 2080. And then we looked at the extreme flood exposure, the 500 year. So again, upper and lower bounds for a region, trying to summarize the data, trying to figure out is this helpful? Do we need more detail, less detail in this type of presentation in a PDF or paper document, and how that moves forward. And so when we look at kind of the reporting for all of this data that we have, there's 4 kind of key factors that we're working with. Now with the flood hazard, where before we were just coastal flooding, we are doing all major sources of flooding. So we'll have coastal flooding, fluvial flooding, fluvial flooding, and then a total or combined flooding. And the data quality varies across those, across that spectrum, especially with the fluvial flood hazard, where again, we're kind of limited to our best available data that we're working with. On the return intervals, we still have the 9 intervals. In our pluvial effort, we have 7 of those intervals, the 2 to the 500. But in the fluvial, I mean, we have the 100-year everywhere with the special flood hazard area, where everywhere where it is mapped, which is not everywhere. And in some limited places, we have multi-frequency return intervals. Again, in the time horizon, we did 20-year intervals. Is that the right approach for phase 2? Do we want to make any adjustments? And then we're looking at our impacts, and there's kind of 4 different levels of impacts: the qualitative and just kind of descriptive impacts, then getting into the quantitative impacts of exposure. Are you in or out of a flooding event? And then the vulnerability, if you're exposed to flooding, does it matter? And then the risk, well, how much does it matter, and primarily captured financially. So there's a lot of information and variables that we can work to calculate and present, but how do we do it? Do we need to make any changes for phase 2? Do we stick with what we did with phase 1? Trying to receive input on those options. So I talked about it a little bit earlier, get into a little bit more detail on the flood hazard and our available data sets. So our coastal flooding, we have it at every 20 years from 2020 to 2100. That coastal flood hazard is based on NOAA's 2017 intermediate high sea level rise and the median value for that. And we'll talk about median versus some of the confidence intervals, but that's what we have for the coastal flood hazard. And we actually have 10 return intervals because we did 10 different scenarios, because we did 1.5 times the mean tidal range and have that data set. But because of how that's calculated, it tends to overlap and intersect with either mean high water in the 2-year. That's not shown in the viewer, but we do have that data. For the pluvial side, again, we'll be crosswalking our interval precipitation to Atlas 14 values, as well as we have our 4 options with the Marissa data, which has 2 different planning scenarios, short-term or near-term 2020 to 2070, longer-term 2050 to 2100, at 2 different RCP intervals, or scenarios 4.5 or 8.5. Then we have 3 different durations and 7 return intervals. And then our fluvial flood hazard, we don't have any future projections. We have the 100-year SFHA everywhere where it exists. So just because it does not exist everywhere because of the limitations to the FEMA modeling, does not include the pluvial. Depth grids, we have most of the 100-year floodplain depth grid. We have some of the 10, 25, 5,100 depth grids, and those limits in very limited locations, mainly in the northern neck and some of Middle Peninsula, some of GW, a little bit up in Northern Virginia as well, but it's not consistent everywhere. So we've got a range of our flood hazard data that we are working to look at our total flood hazard. And again, looking at trying to break down those 9 different return intervals. When you look at the language in code, there's a lot of the words severe and repetitive come up frequently. And should we try to further simplify how we're reporting information to repetitive flooding, severe, and maybe extreme? So 3 categories. Do we stick with 5? Do we have all 7 or 9, depending on what flood source you're looking at? Those are some of the options we want to consider so that we know that we're producing enough data so we can organize it and report it out. And it doesn't mean we're going to do less of the analysis necessarily, but just how we report it and help communicate that information. So before I get into the scenario planning, any thoughts, comments, or questions of all this variety of choices and how we can try to make changes? Whether you think, I guess, do we need to make any changes to our phase 1 approach? Should we stick with it or make some tweaks? And if you think we need to make some modifications, very open to hear where and how it could better help meet your needs or the needs of the region.
So Matt, can I just ask a clarification question?
Yes.
When you have the annual exceedance probabilities for both the precipitation and the tidal flooding, are those, as you move forward in time, are those recalculated for the future forecasts, or are they like based on today's values? Does that make sense? So we have like a 2-year storm today, but then 30 years from now, that will be a 1-year storm or something like that. So does a 2-year storm in each time period mean the same level of precipitation, or does that, and the same level of tidal surge, or does that change over time?
It changes over time.
Okay.
Right. So with the Marissa data, like if the Atlas 14 currently a 1-inch precipitation event is let's get the 50-year return interval. At some future time, let's say 2050, that 1-inch event based on the data is not going to be a 50-year return interval. It's going to be probably maybe closer to a 25. But we're matching, we will go back and crosswalk if we're trying to report. I guess that's what are we looking at annual exceedance probability or the value? And I think we're looking at the annual exceedance probability and then crosswalking it back to which interval do we select there.
Okay.
And so also try to match it to, well, what's the appropriate coastal hazard at that time as well.
Okay. Yeah. So both the precipitation and the storm surge are iterating that way.
Yes. And if I'm wrong, somebody else speak up.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding, because I think then that means it's consistent between the way the two, the pluvial and the storm tidal flooding are being represented, right? So that's great.
Yes. The fluvial is the biggest challenge, and maybe I'll get into that a little here on the next slide. Is we don't have fluvial projections, right, on our rivers. We have some indicators. EPA has some climate risk indicators that looks at stream flow, river flow, but there is no large scale products across our region here that says what is the future of fluvial flooding look like. And so that's kind of what do we do with that? Essentially, is the question. As we look forward, we could add a foot, 2 foot, 3 foot to the base flood elevation, or to whatever the floodplain is. But that, I mean, that's a very wide range of changes in flows and then return intervals based on the geometry of your channel. And if you have a very wide and open channel, 1 foot is a lot more water going through it than just a very narrow constricted channel. And so that kind of gets away from the probability and exceedance probabilities when you start adding a stage or the freeboard elevations on top. It could be done though as a way to estimate future conditions, but as we start, that's the challenge we face, is we're trying to combine coastal projections, so sea level rise projections, with the future precipitation projections and fluvial. Those return intervals and all of the data and confidence in them, it gets very messy. And so if we use the same 20-year planning horizon in phase 1 and try to match up the pluvial and fluvial, this is what's shown on the slide is a way we could do it. I'm not saying it's the way recommended, but in doing it, highlighted in the pluvial side, like the 2060 to 2080, it's like, well, how do you pick what RCP value? You could have some long-term values for pluvial at 2050 to 2100 with RCP 4.5 that are just about the same. Some are higher, some are lower than the short-term RCP 8.5s. And so it's not an easy transition in that period. And then again, the challenge with the fluvial is, well, it's less, there's less statistics behind that, just adding a foot, 1, 2, or 3. Yes, it could represent some future condition, but that future condition of 1 foot is going to vary drastically across our landscape, especially at this scale. And I did put an asterisk to some of that FEMA data, because there is, sorry, not the FEMA, but the federal data. They are working on the federal flood risk management standard data, maybe next summer, but that's going to be tight for our window, especially for phase 2, to get that analysis done and get it all reported out by the end of the year, if that project stays on schedule. So those are some of the questions. And speaking to this, there's a lot of, we use the median values for phase 1 for sea level rise. There's still a lot of uncertainty and variability in those values. And that's just what I'm trying to convey here, is that there, in the short term, and just the recorded data that we have, that line is not smooth and straight up to 2023 of data that we've recorded. There are upper and lower monthly means, interannual variations. So there's still a lot of variability. And then you see out forward looking at some of the updated projections, there's still uncertainty around those median values, and that it's more a range of values, a range of possible options. Not at 2060, we know sea level rise is going to be 1.53 feet higher at this location. It's just not going to be that precise and smooth in the future. And we also have the uncertainty with the pluvial modeling, our future projections. Again, even in our current data, the Atlas 14 has uncertainty and has a confidence interval that they report out. Is it used frequently? I don't know in practice. Probably not as much as it should be. But again, there's future uncertainty as we look forward with the projections that we have moving forward. And here's some of the EPA climate change indicators. And so there's no consistent pattern across the landscape. It's very specific to the watershed. If there's some increases in magnitude or frequency or decreases. And when you look at the values, some are very small, 1% increase or maybe a 10% decrease. So it's still an unknown, especially on the fluvial side. Seems to be a lot more uncertainty here in just looking at the data. So that's the question. How do we try to capture this total, the major sources of flooding that we're required to have in a usable planning product? And so knowing that there's all this uncertainty, do we maybe simplify some of our time horizons instead of every 20 years? Maybe have a near future and a far future value that we're working with, and try to work with upper and lower bounds to see, is this a more appropriate approach for planning with this level of uncertainty? But is this going to confuse? Is this going to be operational? I know a lot more messaging has to come out with it, but that's what we're trying to understand. How do we set ourselves up for what scenarios we should be putting out with phase 2, or do we not change anything for phase 2 and maybe just leave it for the statewide plan?
So Matt, what is our timeline for making that decision? Because the other piece that I'm hearing in this is there's a bit of a social science problem, right? And it's all of the communications work that's been done, especially in emergency management and weather fields, on public response to certain terminology that's used in hazards. And I know that there is some scholarship, because I've been trying to search and listen at the same time, that, when we use the language of return intervals, there tends to be a flood recency bias in how urgent people think that information is, which maybe points us more toward probabilistic information, or even using those additional categories to simplify things. The PDC audience and the locality audience, really in particular, is going to vary in their sophistication in using this information. Your localities who have been our early adopters, have lots of projects in the hopper, have had fairly stable staff, are going to be able to work with the terminology no matter how you put it out there. Rural places where there's been a lot of turnover, where you may have younger staff, and where you also have an environment where that person who's taking the information and is then having to use it to communicate to their elected officials that this is something that we need to fund, this is something you need to allow us to have staff time to do, they're going to have to do that translation too, and that's going to depend on the elected officials. So what's the timeline for how quickly do we make this decision? Is this something where we need to try to do a fairly rapid response kind of survey that takes a look at some of these other studies that have been done, takes a look at how would you respond to, how usable would you find this information if it was presented to you this way, and then use that to make the decision? Or do we just, hey, we need to make this decision by January, so let's just pull something, move on, and then deal with it in the update?
So I think we have some time, but not a lot of time. And I know that's not a great answer. Yeah. But I think we're trying to set ourselves up that we have all the underlying data calculated, right? We have the coastal data that we're probably not going to adjust. I think on the pluvial, we still have to crosswalk and select those terms in the fluvial. We want to make sure we're not missing any of those components as far as what we're calculating and then can do impacts on. We have more time on how it gets packaged. And I think we need to be conscious of package for who, right? Package for our primary audience, who are the PDCs and planners, that we want them to try to incorporate this into their planning efforts. That's one. And then other is helping them get that information out beyond to the public. And we know it's communicating this flood risk is a challenge, but there needs to be some consistent messaging that we can help put out. And I think that'll be part of our long-term kind of communications strategy, is figuring out and guiding how are we conveying this information to the general public, versus our primary audience right now, which is the practitioners that we're focused on. And I think the latter with the general public, it is a much bigger task than just this plan and just DCR. It's the feds, the state, other agencies. And so that's something we need to work on. But for here, I would like to look at the primary audience, so the people that will be using this to put into plans. And we are planning on putting out a survey this quarter to help get some input on from the end users on what was helpful in the how we've delivered the product so far, whether through the Explorer or the plan itself, and how that data is summarized. I don't know that actually I do know we don't go into this level of detail to say I don't want to. If I sent somebody the figure that's on the screen today, I think it'd be too confusing. It needs to be explained. But maybe this figure where we're simplified and there's some options, is this more workable than our current kind of, at 20 years, you have 7 different options that it's just, there's so much even for practitioners. And so I would lean towards this current setup. But I want to know, yes, we do need to get input. And so this is part of our kind of engagement from the subcommittee to know what you all think and the groups that you represent. I think there is an opportunity to do our targeted end user. So the different localities and PDCs, and get their input on this as well. I don't think this isn't something though right now that we plan to put out for public opinion and say what's best, because too many individuals, too many opinions, and too much noise there. But yeah, I think we do want input, and so this is one opportunity. We would like to make this decision. More than likely, we need to start packaging this up next summer, so we know how to do all of our summary tables, try to see what stories the data is telling, so we can put that out there. So end of the year would be ideal for this to know. Depending on the amount of feedback and how it is, it might need another round of and probably will, of refinement of what's perfect. But yes, we are looking for input. This is not something we wanted to make a decision on our own and then just say, here it is. We do want to get the feedback from everyone. And so we have, I know PDCs represented here, but also some of our university staff, and from a scientific perspective, does this make sense? Trying to show the uncertainty that exists and having people not just plan for one specific water level to 1/10 of an inch, but that there's a range that could, and try to get more understanding of that range is likely, and we need to plan for that range. How big the spread is, another decision, but should we have a spread rather than a single value?
Matt, John Bateman put in the chat that simplification is necessary, and Ben McFarland has his hands up.
Good, Ben.
Hey, Matt. So I think what I would recommend we go for is, for the plan, I think having this simplified set of scenarios makes a lot of sense, because that, in my mind, is more of an educational document. It's a common reference, but I think to accompany that, we have the data, right? We have the analysis results that we can do a much more, a much higher resolution kind of look at, exactly what the curve says for any given decade or any given year or whatever we want to type in. And so I think some training or some other, some focused attention on the users of that kind of data, so that when they're trying to answer a question about, what's the level that they need, when we talk about some of the regulatory requirements that we see coming out right now that are saying, what's the lifespan of your project? What's the relative sea level rise expected between, now and when your project is completed, and what over the lifespan of that project might be? some training about how to use these tools to do that for community staff, for localities, for PDCs, I think would be essential. But for the plan, I mean, I think this is very similar to kind of what we've done here in Hampton Roads, where, you know, we set out, we said we've got our near term, we've got our midterm, and we've got our long term projections, because we know that that's not the number that people are really going to be using when they actually go forth and try to build something or design something to account for sea level rise. But I think for the plan, this makes a lot of sense in my mind.
Okay. Thanks, Ben. I think I have a slide. Oh, there was phase 2. So some of that, what you mentioned, Ben, like everybody has different use cases for this data, and the plan is only delivering one time. Should DCR, one, making the data available so you can download and do custom reporting, but should we offer resources and support to help with post-plan technical delivery, right? You've seen what we have, but you have your use case that has a specific request, and the data that we presented, the way we presented that data doesn't match the need that might not even be your need, but a funding source's need. Can we provide support to help customize it to meet your use after delivery of our plan document? So I think that's something, I guess, for consideration. But yeah, thank you, Ben.
I think Rachel had her hand up next, and then Molly, and then there's a couple comments in the chat.
I just support what Ben was just mentioning. So from a VMRC perspective, you know, our new shoreline guidelines, you know, explicitly say that, you know, projects need to be designed for the useful life of the project. And so this is the kind of data that people are going to need in order to make those designs, that we need to allow wetlands to move over time. Well, what does that mean and how can we evaluate it? So I guess this is in support of what Ben said, but also in our ability to utilize this in the future for, you know, policymaking decisions and things of that sort.
Thanks,
And then
Rachel.
Molly.
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to inject one word of caution. I think that the idea of presenting a simple platform and then but having the data behind it is a great one. It's in terms of the picking, when you talk about a lower bound and then an upper bound. So one of the difficulties, and so like the sea level rise, you're only using one curve, right? The intermediate high. But one of the difficulties is, although there are people who present the upper and lower spread there in sea level rise, is that the lower two scenarios are actually require significant action in the next 30 years to even come close to those. So they're not very realistic lower bounds. And I'm not sure about the precipitation ones. The RCP 4.5 and 8.5 are kind of old scenarios, and the global models have moved on from those. So I think it would be worth checking to see that those lower bounds are still considered realistic to achieve before presenting them, because planning for them, if they're not realistic, isn't, you know, going to help.
Great comment. Yes, thank you, Molly. And that was looking at even this pluvial line here. Like, do we mix RCPs here, or use a median value for 4.5 and a median for 8.5, or do we pick one and then use the upper and lower of that RCP? There's still so many more options and decision points to go, and that's where, yes, the details will be tougher, but we'll have some limitation on really just based on what's available to us right now. How do we try to mix and match? And I think the messaging would be more on, yes, a lower and upper. The details of what's in that lower will be available for people to read into and the appendix, but not something that we want to put up front and confuse and cause a lot of questioning. But we do want to think about it a lot now to figure out how best to set it up so that we get the most amount of buy-in for this, and that people have some confidence in how it's presented, that it is useful as a tool that is representative, like you said, of an actual realistic condition. and there's a range of beliefs on what's realistic and not, and trying to, again, find a nice sweet spot that meets most of our primary audience's needs. Ben?
Hey, Matt, yeah, I want to just chime in on that. And thanks, Molly, for bringing that up. In thinking about how we would like for this thing to be used, I think there's a lot of, I think illustrating the uncertainty and that we've got a range of possibilities out there. That's great for some uses. It's not as good for others, right? And if the idea, if by portraying that whole range of uncertainty, that we end up incentivizing or encouraging people to undertake more risk than is ideal, or that we would otherwise want them to do, then it kind of is defeating the purpose of this document, right? This is not meant to be a NOAA technical analysis of what sea level rise may or may not do in Virginia. It's meant to be a plan, right? It's meant to be kind of a vision of kind of what we think our risk is and what we're going to do about mitigating that risk. And so I wonder if one option for this might be that instead of doing like the lower and upper, where we're trying to show, well, we've got low scenarios and we've got high scenarios, that instead we emphasize that there's a median, which is in the middle, and then we show the upper bound. We say, this is where we think it's going to go, most likely going to go this way, but it could be as bad as this. And that way, I think, yes, we are, I think, kind of maybe downplaying the risk that things can turn out better than they are forecast right now. But if we plan for too much sea level rise, at the end of the day, we have less risk from flooding, right? So at the margin, yes, that might cause some projects to not take place, or some things to cost more money. But for a document like this, when we're talking about these kind of the higher level risk assessment we're trying to do, in my mind, that's an approach that would encourage people to undertake the actions that we're trying to encourage them to do, as opposed to looking at it and saying, oh, well, it's only going to be, it could be only half a foot of sea level rise because that's what the historic low rate is, right? Which we all know, as Molly said, like that rate is not valid for planning purposes.
No, that's a great point, Ben. And I think, well, I know lower and upper bound, we don't have to use those terms. We could use the minimum planning requirements, critical planning requirements, or try to tie it to the amount of risk we're willing to take, or the potential impacts. Where you have critical infrastructure, you should use that upper limit to consider the risk because of how critical it is, and everything else might be able to use the standard limit. But I like your approach of not the lower, but maybe a median and an upper. I think that's it's nice, and I think we can try to look at that some more, again, based on what available data we have. How do we pair it up for these two to give a range of values at two different time horizons? Are there any thoughts on two time horizons? Well, two future horizons. Do we need a third? Is two enough? Anybody feel strongly one way or the other? I went with two because some of our pluvial data has the two, and that's kind of the limiting. If we go to the third, how we develop that third in between the two of those just adds another decision point of it's not necessarily simple. So any thoughts on 2 versus 3?
Matt, one thought on this. I think 2 is fine. For some of the research folks that are on the call, I think that the most recent NOAA guidance also uses 2. They have 2 timeframes they have, they're looking at it from the data, kind of the certainty perspective, if my memory is serving me well. So coming up with a third, we'd have to somehow figure out what those numbers would be. And so maybe just kind of trying to use the timeframes that, the authoritative bodies are actually already using right now. I think that would help us with what we're trying to do. I think just coming up with a third might just be not quite as useful as it would otherwise seem. But I will defer to any of the folks that have more recently read those documents. It's been a while.
It sounds like two future time horizons.
Yeah,
with two options for each time horizon.
Yeah, the one thing that I do want to throw in there, and I'm sorry to be a nerd on this, is to be really, really careful about how we're messaging this, not necessarily in regards to sea level rise, but in regards to rainfall. And I know Celso's on, and he can probably tell us like way more than I'm able to tell folks. But when we start getting into rainfall, it's not necessarily that we cut off that lower bound because more climate change always equals wetter. We're talking about trying to take climate models and drive them to what people functionally care about, which is the decision about extreme events, which gets to be really, really challenging. And we want to be sure that that's packaged in a way, if you are tossing that lower bound, that you're not implying that that lower bound doesn't exist. There are models where, you bias wetter or you bias drier, and it's not necessarily linearly linked to the forcing. So I think we just want to be careful if we say we're only going to plan for the more extreme because that's the flood that we care about, that's what we're messaging, and not necessarily acknowledging that there are situations where drier scenarios exist, but we'd care about that if we were talking about drought.
Thanks, Jess. Adding another one to the messaging part, and the use of terms and words matter, and explaining how we made a selection for our purposes and it might not meet everybody's use case again. And so what is the use of this, as well as what are the limitations that our efforts and how it could be applied. Trying to go any other, so we talked a good amount on the planning scenarios. I guess any thoughts in Web Explorer versus the PDF, in the Web Explorer, because it was meant for practitioners on a desktop computer with a monitor, we tried to put a lot of information in there, giving more maybe than sometimes people wanted, versus the PDF where we slimmed it down just because of text and page limitations. Does everybody still agree with that approach a little bit more on the Web Explorer, or should it be a one-to-one relationship in that what we present in the PDF, we should also mirror in the Web Explorer?
I just want to put a plug in for how much I love the Web Explorer and how well done it is. I use it and screen grabs from it very, very frequently in presentations to the public, when we're having conversations with counties, when we're talking about things, when we're trying to talk to people who are interested in resilience but not necessarily as familiar with the information that's already been pulled together. And I have continued to be surprised about, in some of those interactions, how somebody may be asking me, they're recently become an elected official, and pull something up, and I'm digging things in there, and I may end up needing to grab some of the social vulnerability information by household in a particular area. So I think having that in the Web Explorer is very, very useful in multiple situations. So I just wanted to put a plug in there that I have actually used it that way, and am grateful it exists, because I like it better than the federal products that are out there.
Thank you, Jess. I think we have some members of Dewberry that really helped put this together, so I'm sure they're glad to hear that as well. I know one of our challenges now with the Web Explorer, especially looking at the major sources of flooding, how do we combine fluvial, and the coastal data, knowing that the data varies? in its fidelity and resolution and time periods. So that is something we're starting to think about, and we'll probably talk about in a future subcommittee and with the TAC, is how best to do that and what's most important to convey individuals' flood sources versus combined. And I say combined flooding, not necessarily compound flooding. So not when it's raining, when we have surge, but if at any given, at my house, do I have exposure to just fluvial? Do I have fluvial and pluvial, or do I have a coastal? What are the sources of flooding that I may be exposed to? What's the dominant source of flooding or the most likely source of flooding for a given location? And how to communicate that information within these planning scenarios. That's something we're trying to wrap our heads around and figure out how to do that within, trying to work within the current Web Explorer framework, and maybe add some different layers or tabs to help give some options there. All right. Any other thoughts or comments on kind of the scenarios and how we're presenting and organizing this information before we move on to the next topic on the agenda? All right, seeing none. Any discussion points that the subcommittee members would like to have and bring up, either for today? We have about 10 minutes left until public comment, or if you'd like to discuss some topics for our future agenda, our future meetings. Open the floor to the subcommittee members. All right, hearing none, we will now take any public comment. So if there's any members of the public that are on this meeting, please let us know using the chat window that you would like to provide public comment. We'll see how many sign up, and then split up the time as needed, but try to limit it to a few minutes or so. So are there any members that have volunteered for public comment?
No one has responded. I put a note out about 10 minutes ago or 5 minutes ago. Oh, sorry, we do have one.
All right. Hey, Kelso.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the work you guys are doing. This is fantastic. I wanted to echo the importance of the communication piece of this. I joined the meeting late, but I was looking at that table. And even I was having a really hard time to follow the whole future scenario, the two intervals. So there's time window, there's the scenario window that moves with it with 3 hazards. So thinking about how that is going to come down to the people actually using it, I think it's really important. I don't have a solution. I just wanted to echo the importance of that piece.
Thank you. Yes, we know that's going to be a challenge, and trying to, I think, hopefully present it in a one way. And if people want to know what are all the ingredients and at what rates, and then kind of have an appendix document, but try to focus on simplified messaging to move it forward. But yeah, we'll need to pick the right words and have a smart marketing and communications plan for that. All right. So action items review. I think hearing no objections to our old business items, I'm going to make the internal recommendations that we proceed with the depth threshold, land cover data, and precipitation values that we discussed here internally, and we will report out on the progress of those works at the TAC meeting. I know I need to do some more research based on your all input, and I think we'll continue the discussion on how to organize this data with end users in focus. And so DCR is planning on doing an end user survey we will talk internally how best to capture some more of these details that are probably another level down from where the survey currently stands. But we will report back out to you all, and probably the TAC as well, at the TAC meeting on the 15th of December, of trying to figure out how to get that information. There will still be opportunities for input on the new items and those decision points regarding packaging the total flood hazard and how we go about working with that. And I'm sure I have more action items that we will capture in the minutes, and the minutes, we will be posting them within 10 days of this meeting to Regulatory Town Hall. And so by the end of the month, no later, hopefully by the end of the next week, we shall have the meeting minutes posted, which will include the action items that were documented during the meeting minutes. The next meeting has not been scheduled. For our Q1 meeting will happen sometime in the new year. It will need to be an in-person meeting. And we will work with the chair on finding a date, time, and location. If anybody has any recommendations or requests for date, time, or location, please let us know. We do have the survey results where you all have indicated preferences for days of the week and morning or afternoon, and we'll try to be as accommodating as possible. Again, we'll try to get the slides out at least a week before. Hopefully that was helpful for this meeting to at least see a little bit more information about what we were planning to discuss. And then agenda items for the next meeting, which we will probably need to update based on our discussions, and probably cover the old business of what we discussed in our new business today, and the integrated climate scenario planning approach and what that approach may look like. But also want to start getting into working on future plans and the recommendations for future plans, that those recommendations are something that we would want you all to have a consensus on and potentially vote for adoption to include in the plan document itself. And so some of the items that were brought up today were the need to look at the flood data, and do we need a plan for what flooding data we want to have, whether it's BLEs or some other type of flood model or flood data, and at how much does that cost over what period, and is that a pathway? And if we don't get to a specific recommendation, at least a recommendation that needs to be done in part of maybe the statewide plan, can get put into the plan document itself, as well as other recommendations. If you have any request for agenda items, please send them to the chair and myself, and we can work on looking at those and incorporating them. Again, if you have any requests for additional invited guests to participate in the discussion, please let us know. Are there any other items? Evan, any last words for the meeting?
I don't think so. Just thank you, Matt, and thanks to everyone for your contributions. It was a good discussion.
All right. With that said, we're going to adjourn. I guess we need to take a motion to adjourn. I'm not great at all the procedural parts of these public meetings, but I guess we can offer a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
offered.
All right. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again for all your input. Take care.